How did I give birth to a child that isn't mine? I was grocery shopping with my daughter when her pediatrician called me. Your daughter's blood work came back. We need to discuss immediately. The next morning in his office, Dr. Morito kept clearing his throat. Susanna's blood type is a negative, he finally said. Your records show you're O positive. Your husband is a B negative. He paused. Susanna cannot biologically be your child. I actually laughed because obviously the lab screwed up. These things happen all the time. But he was already sliding a second test across his desk from a completely different lab. Same results. My husband Zyler drove us to get DNA testing that afternoon. He kept squeezing my hand saying the blood type thing had to be wrong, but something in his eyes said he wasn't so sure. 3 days later, the results confirmed Susanna was his biological daughter, but she shared zero DNA with me. His hand went limp in mine. What aren't you telling me? His voice was small, like he was scared of the answer. When I went to sleep that night, I found him going through my old journals looking for evidence of affairs I never had. When he found nothing, he demanded we prove I actually gave birth to Susanna. When I was crying too hard to respond, he just rolled his eyes and claimed I was gaslighting him. But a few days later, the hospital pulled our delivery footage. There I was, 5 years ago, pushing out this exact baby while Zyler cut the cord. But the administrator kept saying, this doesn't change the DNA results. Like I was too stupid to understand science. Zyler accused me of secretly using donor eggs. I kept begging him to remember the 36 hours of back contractions, him watching our daughter crown. But I guess my MIL's constant whisperings about how I shouldn't be trusted finally worked, because it was like talking to a wall. Zyler started sleeping in the guest room. He'd stare at Susanna during breakfast like he was looking for traces of another woman in her face. Susanna asked why Daddy wouldn't hug her anymore. We were at Olive Garden pretending to be a happy family when it happened. A drunk woman came up to our table laughing. Your daughter looks exactly like my sister who died 6 years ago. She pulled out her phone showing me photos. Susanna was identical. Same upturned nose, birthmark behind her left ear. My sister used to donate eggs. So who knows? The woman continued before walking away. Zyler played it cool until Susanna was asleep. You used a dead woman's eggs? He screamed in our kitchen. I grabbed his face and tried to show him the desperation in my eyes, but no amount of denying changed anything. My mother called the next morning asking why I'd done something so deceptive, and when I insisted I hadn't, she sighed like I was a teenager caught smoking. Just tell us the truth. We'll still love you. My dad stopped answering my calls entirely. Even my mother-in-law, who'd been there for Susanna's birth, suddenly remembered I'd been secretive during pregnancy. The next day, Susanna came home with her unicorn backpack dragging on the ground. Her tiny self was shaking. My classmate Timmy said I came from a dead lady. He said you stole me from her tummy. Her voice cracked. And Cynthia's mom told Cynthia not to play with me because I'm not real. She buried her face in my chest. Am I not real, Mommy? Update. My lawyer said that without biological connection, I had no case. The dead woman's family got visitation rights as biological grandparents. Zyler had testified on their behalf, showing the court DNA evidence and arguing Susanna deserved to know her biological heritage. Zyler got full custody. I get supervised visits on Sunday afternoons. Susanna clings to me the entire time while the supervisor takes notes. She keeps asking when she can come home. I lie and say soon. But soon that lie came true. I was sitting in my car outside Susanna's dance recital when I saw them together. Zyler walking hand in hand with the woman from Olive Garden. The drunk one who'd shown me her dead sister's photos. She wasn't drunk anymore. She kissed Zyler while Susanna ran to them after her performance. Everything finally clicked. She'd never been drunk. Her sister never donated eggs. I hired a private investigator who found the truth within a week. Zyler and this woman had been together since before Susanna was born. I'd lost everything that mattered. And when you have nothing left to lose, you'd be amazed what you're capable of. I knew exactly what I had to do to get Susanna back. I sat in my car for 20 minutes just staring at them through the windshield. My hands were shaking so bad I couldn't even grip the steering wheel. Everything started making sense in the worst possible way. The timing of that woman showing up at Olive Garden wasn't random at all. She knew exactly when we'd be there because Zyler told her. The way he immediately jumped to accusing me instead of being confused like any normal husband would be. How fast my own parents turned against me when Zyler started spreading his lies. Even my mother-in-law suddenly remembering things that never happened during my pregnancy. They'd planned this whole thing together. I took out my phone and snapped a photo of them kissing while Susanna was still inside the dance studio. My hands finally stopped shaking because now I had a purpose. I drove straight to the office of a private investigator my divorce lawyer had mentioned months ago. The building was old and the elevator creaked, but I didn't care about anything except getting answers. I pushed the photo across his desk and told him I needed everything on these two people. Their history, their finances, their medical records if he could get them. Any connection between them needed to be found. He said he'd start immediately, and took a retainer that cleaned out most of my savings. But I didn't care because this was my only shot at getting Susanna back. 3 days felt like 3 years waiting for his call. When my phone finally rang, I was in the middle of making dinner and dropped the entire pot of pasta on the floor. His voice was serious when he told me to sit down. The phone records he'd pulled showed Zyler and this woman, Rebecca was her real name, had been calling and texting each other for over 7 years. 2 whole years before Susanna was even born. 7 years of them planning whatever sick game they were playing with my life. I met him at his office the next morning, and he spread out credit card statements across his desk. My stomach turned as I read through them. Regular payments to a fertility clinic starting 8 months before I got pregnant. All from a personal account in Zyler's name that I never even knew existed. Thousands of dollars going to this clinic while he was telling me we should just keep trying naturally. The investigator pulled up Rebecca's old social media posts on his laptop. There were posts about her sister dying 6 years ago, just like she'd said at the restaurant. But when he dug deeper into public records, her sister never donated eggs to any program. That whole story was made up just to throw me off track and make me look crazy. The pieces were falling into place, but I still didn't understand the biggest question. If they used someone else's eggs at that fertility clinic, how did they get them into me without me knowing? The thought hit me so hard I barely made it to the bathroom before throwing up. I spent the rest of that night on the bathroom floor, sick from realizing what they must have done to me. The investigator called the next day with another bombshell. Rebecca worked as a nurse at the same hospital where I delivered Susanna. She'd had access to all my medical records during my entire pregnancy. She could see every appointment, every test result, every single detail about my body and my baby. She was there the whole time, watching and waiting and making sure their plan worked. That's when I remembered something that hadn't seemed important at the time. When we were trying to get pregnant, Zyler kept pushing for us to see a specific fertility doctor for a consultation. We'd only been trying for 6 months and I thought it was way too soon to worry, but he insisted. He said he just wanted to be proactive and make sure everything was okay. He even made the appointment himself and drove me there. I thought he was being sweet and supportive. The investigator went back to that fertility clinic and somehow got copies of their records. What he found made my blood run cold. Zyler had signed consent forms for IVF procedures at that clinic. My signature was on the documents too, but the second I saw them, I knew it wasn't my handwriting. Someone had forged my name on papers agreeing to procedures I never knew about. The investigator suggested I hire a handwriting expert to prove the signatures were fake. I found one through my lawyer and paid another chunk of my dwindling savings for a rush analysis. The expert spent 2 days comparing the forged signatures to samples of my real handwriting from checks and documents. His report was 12 pages long with side-by-side comparisons showing exactly how the signatures were different. The angle of certain letters, the pressure points, the way I crossed my T's, none of it matched. He said there was zero chance I'd sign those documents myself. Someone had practiced copying my signature but hadn't gotten it quite right. Now I had proof that Zyler and Rebecca had planned this whole thing years before Susanna was born. They'd forged medical documents to create a baby using someone else's eggs, and then somehow got that baby inside me without my knowledge. They'd stolen my body and my life, and then turned everyone against me when their plan started falling apart. But I finally had evidence that could prove I wasn't crazy. And maybe, just maybe, get my daughter back. The investigator called me 2 days later with something that made me drop my coffee mug. The fertility doctor Zyler had pushed us to see wasn't just some random specialist. He was Rebecca's cousin, had been for 37 years, same family reunions and everything. I pulled up the clinic's website on my laptop, and there he was in the staff photo, same last name as Rebecca's maiden name. The investigator had court records showing they'd been business partners in 2 failed ventures before he opened his fertility practice. This whole thing was a family operation from the start. I went back through my medical records from that clinic visit 6 years ago. The paperwork said I'd had a routine procedure to check if my tubes were blocked. They'd given me something to relax me because I was nervous about the test. But when I looked closer at the consent forms, buried in the small print was permission for anesthesia. Not just local, but full sedation for what should have been a simple procedure. The investigator got his hands on the clinic's internal records through a contact who worked there. What we found made me throw up again. On the same day as my tube check, they'd logged an embryo transfer procedure in their system. Same operating room, same time slot, but the patient name field was blank. The embryo had been created 3 months earlier using donor eggs from a college student and stored in their freezer. The investigator kept digging and found Rebecca's employee access logs from the hospital. She'd looked at my medical files 47 times during my pregnancy. Every blood test, every ultrasound, every single appointment note. The IT department had flagged it once, but Rebecca's supervisor approved it, saying she needed the records for training purposes. Nobody questioned why a labor and delivery nurse needed to review one specific patient's records that many times. I took everything to a new lawyer, a woman named Sarah who specialized in medical fraud cases. She spread all the documents across her conference table, and her face got redder with each page she read. She kept shaking her head and muttering about violations and criminal conspiracy. When she finished reading, she looked at me and said this was the worst case of reproductive coercion she'd seen in 20 years of practice. Sarah filed emergency motions with the court that same afternoon. She demanded immediate custody reconsideration based on evidence of fraud and conspiracy. She also contacted the medical board about the fertility doctor's involvement and sent them copies of everything we'd found. The board launched an investigation within 48 hours. 3 weeks later, the fertility doctor's license got suspended pending a full investigation. The medical board's preliminary report found serious irregularities in his practice going back years. 3 other women came forward after seeing news coverage about his suspension. They all had similar stories about procedures they didn't remember consenting to and babies that didn't match their DNA. One woman had been told she was infertile, but somehow got pregnant after a routine exam at his clinic. Rebecca's situation fell apart even faster than the doctor's. The hospital launched their own investigation into the access log violations. When they pulled her complete history, they found she'd accessed hundreds of patient files without authorization over 5 years. She tried to claim she was doing research for a nursing degree but couldn't produce any proof of enrollment. The hospital fired her immediately and reported her to the state nursing board. Her nursing license got suspended the next day. My next supervised visit with Susanna came 2 days after Rebecca got fired. I held my daughter so tight she squeaked and asked if I was okay. I told her I was just happy to see her. The supervisor, an older woman who'd been watching our visits for months, wrote in her notes that Susanna seemed more relaxed and happy than she'd seen in recent visits with her father. Susanna told me Daddy had been yelling a lot lately, and the lady who lived with them now kept crying. She asked when she could come back to my house because she missed her pink bedroom. Sarah started deposing the fertility clinic staff the following week. Most of them claimed they didn't know anything unusual was happening. But then she got to a nurse who'd worked there for 8 years. The woman started crying halfway through the deposition. She said she'd always felt something was wrong with certain procedures. She'd seen patients come in for routine exams and leave groggy from sedation. When she'd asked the doctor about it, he told her to mind her own business or find another job. She needed the money for her kids' medical bills, so she kept quiet. The nurse had kept copies of internal documents on a flash drive because she was scared of getting blamed if something went wrong. She handed the drive to Sarah right there in the deposition room. The files showed detailed records of embryo creation using donor eggs and Zyler's sperm. The egg donor was a 19-year-old college student who'd answered an ad for egg donation to pay her tuition. The records showed she'd been paid $5,000 and signed papers saying she had no claim to any resulting children. But there was no record of anyone telling her that her eggs would be used to trick another woman into pregnancy. Sarah tracked down the egg donor within 2 days using the clinic's records. The girl's name was Ashley, and she was 23 now, working as a dental assistant in the next town over. Sarah called her, and Ashley agreed to meet us at a coffee shop that afternoon. When Ashley walked in and saw the photos of Susanna on my phone, her hand flew to her mouth. She kept saying she had no idea, over and over, tears streaming down her face. She pulled out her own phone, showing us the consent forms she'd signed 4 years ago. The papers said her eggs would help infertile couples. Nothing about being used without a woman's knowledge. Ashley said she'd testify in court. She'd do whatever it took to help me get Susanna back. She even offered to write a statement right there in the coffee shop about how she never agreed to this kind of deception. Sarah recorded Ashley's statement on her phone while I sat there watching this young woman cry about eggs she'd donated to pay for nursing school that never happened because she got too sick to finish. The custody hearing got scheduled for 3 weeks later. Zyler's lawyer filed a response to our emergency motion arguing that biological connection was what mattered for custody. He claimed that even if fraud happened during conception, Zyler was still Susanna's biological father, with established parental rights. Sarah's response was brutal. She filed a 30-page brief detailing how Zyler violated my bodily autonomy through medical fraud. She compared it to assault, saying no court should reward a man who conspired to impregnate his wife without her informed consent. The judge read both briefs and ordered something called a guardian ad litem to be appointed for Susanna. The guardian's name was Jasmine, and she was a retired social worker who'd been doing this for 15 years. Jasmine called me the day after her appointment to schedule interviews with everyone involved. She wanted to observe Susanna with both me and Zyler separately. Jasmine came to my supervised visit that Sunday and watched Susanna run into my arms the second she saw me. Susanna wouldn't let go for the first 10 minutes, just holding on like I might disappear. Jasmine took notes while Susanna showed me drawings she'd made of us together in our old house. Every picture had me and her. None had Zyler. Jasmine asked Susanna gentle questions about where she wanted to live. Susanna said she wanted to go home with Mommy, but Daddy said that wasn't allowed anymore. Jasmine's pen stopped moving when Susanna said, Daddy told her I wasn't her real mommy, that her real mommy was an egg in a doctor's office. Susanna asked Jasmine if that meant she didn't come from my tummy like she always thought. Jasmine observed 3 more visits over the next 2 weeks. She watched Susanna have a panic attack when the visit ended, clinging to my leg while the supervisor had to physically remove her. She documented how Susanna had started wetting the bed again after never having accidents for 2 years. She interviewed Susanna's teacher, who said the girl cried every day at the school asking when her mommy was coming back. Jasmine interviewed Zyler too, and her report later described how he spent the entire interview talking about his biological rights. He never once mentioned Susanna's emotional needs or well-being. He showed Jasmine DNA tests like they were winning lottery tickets. Jasmine asked him why he'd been telling Susanna I wasn't her real mother. He said he was just being honest with his daughter about biology. Rebecca filed a petition with the court asking for step-parent visitation rights since she'd been living with Zyler and Susanna. Sarah shut that down in one hearing. She stood up and told the judge that Rebecca participated in criminal conspiracy to violate my reproductive autonomy. She said letting Rebecca near Susanna would be like giving a kidnapper visitation with their victim. The judge denied Rebecca's petition immediately. Everything exploded when the FBI got involved. Sarah had contacted them about the interstate medical fraud since the fertility clinic had locations in 3 states. 2 agents showed up at Zyler's house with a warrant for his financial records. They seized his computers, phones, and boxes of documents. Zyler hired a criminal defense attorney that same day. Rebecca got her own lawyer too. Both of them stopped cooperating with any investigation, pleading the fifth in every deposition. The news picked up the story after the FBI raid. The headline read, "Local father accused of reproductive fraud in custody battle," with mine and Zyler's pictures underneath. My phone started ringing nonstop. My mom called crying so hard she could barely talk. She kept saying she was sorry, that she should have believed me, that she knew I would never lie about something like this. She said Dad was devastated about abandoning me when I needed them most. They drove down that night and held me while I sobbed about missing Susanna. Even my mother-in-law called after seeing the news. She said Zyler had been feeding her lies about me for years, making her suspicious of everything I did. She said she was horrified by what her son had done and wanted to testify on my behalf if it would help. She admitted she'd been wrong about me and begged my forgiveness. Jasmine filed her report with the court after 3 weeks of investigation. It was 12 pages detailing Susanna's deteriorating emotional state under Zyler's custody. She wrote that I was the only mother Susanna had ever known, and separation had caused significant psychological trauma. She documented Zyler's emotional manipulation of telling a 5-year-old that her mother wasn't real. Jasmine recommended immediate custody reversal with supervised visitation for Zyler. She said Susanna needed therapeutic reunification with her primary attachment figure, which was me. The emergency custody hearing happened 2 weeks later in the same courtroom where I'd lost everything just months before. Zyler sat at the other table with his lawyer, a thin man in a gray suit who kept shuffling papers and whispering in Zyler's ear. Sarah stood up first and presented Jasmine's report to the judge, page by page, highlighting every instance of psychological harm Susanna had suffered. The judge read through it slowly, his eyebrows rising higher with each page. Zyler's lawyer jumped up and started pacing in front of the judge's bench. He pulled out a folder thick with papers and waved it around, claiming I was emotionally unstable from the whole ordeal. He said the stress had made me unfit to parent. He showed printouts of my social media where I'd posted about missing Susanna. He called it obsessive behavior. Sarah stood up so fast her chair scraped against the floor. She handed the judge my work evaluations from the past 6 months showing perfect attendance and excellent performance reviews. She showed him letters from my neighbors saying I was always calm and collected even during supervised visits. She presented receipts showing I'd maintained Susanna's bedroom exactly as she'd left it, buying new clothes in bigger sizes for when she came home. The judge looked at Zyler's lawyer and shook his head. After 40 minutes of arguments, the judge banged his gavel. He said the evidence was clear that Susanna belonged with her mother. He granted me immediate temporary full custody while the criminal case moved forward. Zyler would get supervised visits every other Saturday for 2 hours. Rebecca was banned from any contact with Susanna at all. Zyler's face went white and he grabbed his lawyer's arm, but the man just shook his head. I had to grip the table to keep from falling over. Sarah squeezed my shoulder and whispered that we needed to go get Susanna right now. The judge signed the order and handed it to the bailiff. 2 police officers met us outside the courthouse to escort us to Zyler's house. The drive took 20 minutes but felt like hours. My hands shook so bad I had to sit on them. When we pulled up to the house I'd once called home, one officer walked to the door while the other stayed with me. Zyler answered and the officer showed him the court order. I could see him arguing, but the officer just stood there waiting. Then I saw her. Susanna came running out the door in her purple dress, the one with unicorns on it. She saw me getting out of the car and screamed, "Mommy!" so loud the whole neighborhood probably heard. She ran straight into my arms and wrapped her little legs around my waist. She was crying and saying "Mommy" over and over into my neck. Her whole body shook against mine. I held her so tight I worried I might hurt her, but she just squeezed back harder. The officers had to help us into the car because neither of us would let go. Susanna sat in my lap the whole ride to my apartment, even though she was supposed to be in her car seat. The officers didn't say anything about it. When we got home, Susanna wouldn't let me put her down. I carried her inside and she looked around at everything like she was memorizing it. She kept touching my face like she was making sure I was real. That night she refused to sleep in her own bed. She climbed into mine and pressed herself against me, her little hand gripping my shirt. Every hour or so she'd wake up with a gasp and pat my arm. I'd whisper that I was still there and wasn't going anywhere. She'd nod and close her eyes but keep her hand on me. Around 3 in the morning she woke up crying from a nightmare. I rubbed her back and promised her 100 times that she was never leaving me again. She made me pinky promise. Then she made me double pinky promise. By morning, we'd probably promised each other 500 times. When the sun came up, I asked her what she wanted for breakfast. She said chocolate chip pancakes, the way I always made them with extra chips hidden in the middle. I carried her to the kitchen on my hip, even though she was getting too big for that. She watched me mix the batter and measure the chips. When I flipped the first pancake, she clapped like it was magic. We ate at the little table by the window, and she started to look more like herself. Her eyes weren't as scared. She took a big bite and chocolate got all over her chin. Then she looked at me with those serious eyes kids get sometimes. "Mommy, is the bad stuff over?" she asked. I wiped her chin with a napkin and told her yes, we were safe now. She nodded and went back to her pancakes but kept one hand reaching across the table to hold mine. 3 days later, Sarah called while Susanna was coloring at the coffee table. She said Zyler and Rebecca had been indicted by a federal grand jury. The charges included conspiracy to commit fraud, reproductive coercion, assault, and a bunch of other things I didn't fully understand. She said they were facing serious prison time if convicted. She said the FBI had enough evidence to bury them. I thanked her and hung up. Susanna looked up from her coloring book and asked who was on the phone. I told her it was just the lawyer with some grown-up stuff. She went back to coloring her butterfly. A week later, I got a call from the egg donor whose eggs they'd stolen. She was filing her own civil lawsuit against the clinic and everyone involved. She wanted to make sure this could never happen to another woman. She asked if I'd support her case, and I said absolutely. She said she'd been violated too and wanted justice for both of us. I started taking Susanna to see a therapist the next week. The woman specialized in children who'd been through trauma. Susanna liked her because she had toys in her office and let Susanna play while they talked. After the 3rd session, the therapist told me Susanna was resilient but would need time. She said the psychological manipulation from Zyler telling her I wasn't her real mom had done damage. She said it would take months of steady love and stability to fully heal, but she said Susanna was already showing improvement just from being back with me. 3 months passed with Susanna going to therapy twice a week and slowly getting back to normal. Then Sarah called with news. Zyler had decided to plead guilty to avoid going to trial. The federal prosecutor had offered him a deal for 8 years in federal prison. He also had to pay massive restitution for the medical fraud and emotional damage. Sarah said he took it because if he'd gone to trial and lost, he could have gotten 20 years. The next day, we learned Rebecca had pleaded guilty too. She got 6 years as part of her plea deal. During her allocution in court, she had to admit what they'd done. Sarah was there and called me right after. Rebecca had stood up and admitted they'd planned the whole thing for years. She couldn't have children and wanted Zyler's baby, but didn't want to deal with another woman being the mother. So they came up with the plan to use stolen eggs and trick me into carrying the baby. She admitted to forging my signature and accessing my medical records. She admitted to pretending to be drunk at the restaurant. She admitted it was all planned to destroy me and take Susanna. The judge ordered the bailiff to take Rebecca back to holding while the court processed her guilty plea paperwork. 2 weeks later, the medical board called me about the fertility doctor who'd done this to me. They'd already pulled his license pending their investigation, but now they wanted my full statement for the criminal case. I spent 4 hours at their offices going through every single document the private investigator had found. The board's lawyer kept shaking her head as she read through the forged consent forms. She showed me 3 other cases they'd found just that week with the same doctor's signature on fake paperwork. The FBI agent assigned to the case said they were treating it as interstate medical fraud since the clinic had locations in 3 states. The main clinic location got shut down the next month with yellow tape across the doors and federal agents carrying out boxes of files. Sarah called me that afternoon saying 12 more women had come forward with stories about procedures they never agreed to. Some had eggs taken without consent, and others had embryos switched or destroyed without their knowledge. The civil lawsuit Sarah filed on my behalf moved fast once the criminal convictions came through. The clinic's insurance company wanted to settle quick before more victims joined the case. They offered $2 million, which Sarah said would cover everything Susanna needed, plus our fresh start somewhere new. I signed the settlement papers in Sarah's office while Susanna colored at the coffee table. We found a house 40 minutes away in a school district where nobody knew our story. The moving truck came on a Saturday, and Susanna helped pack her toys in boxes with unicorn stickers. She ran through the empty rooms of our old house saying goodbye to each one. Our new neighbors brought cookies the first week, and their kids invited Susanna to play without asking any questions about her past. My parents started picking her up from the school twice a week to make up for all the time they'd missed. They'd take her for ice cream and to the park, and spoil her with little gifts from the dollar store. My dad built her a swing set in our new backyard, and taught her how to pump her legs to go higher. My mother would call every night to read Susanna bedtime stories over the phone. Even my mother-in-law asked if she could maintain some relationship with Susanna through supervised video calls. She never mentioned Zyler and always kept the conversations light and fun for Susanna. She'd send birthday cards and holiday gifts and always signed them just Grandma without any other comments. The egg donor whose eggs they'd stolen sent me a letter 6 months after the trial ended. She said she'd been following the case and wondered if maybe someday when Susanna was older they could meet. I wrote back saying maybe when Susanna turned 18 she could make that choice for herself. The woman understood and said she'd wait however long it took. A full year passed in our new house, and Susanna finally stopped having the bad dreams that used to wake her up crying. Her teacher sent home a note saying she was doing great in the school and had lots of friends. The therapist we'd been seeing said Susanna had made amazing progress processing everything that happened. She was back to being a happy kid who laughed at silly jokes and sang made-up songs while she played. I met Tom at a school fundraiser where he was volunteering at the bake sale table. He made Susanna laugh by pretending the brownies could talk in funny voices. We started talking while the kids played on the playground, and he asked if we wanted to get pizza sometime. I told him our whole story on our 3rd date, expecting him to run away. Instead, he reached across the table and held my hand, saying we all had complicated pasts. He never treated us like we were broken or different from any other family. He'd come to Susanna's soccer games and cheer louder than anyone when she kicked the ball. He taught her how to ride a bike without training wheels in our driveway. He'd make us pancakes on Sunday mornings and let Susanna put way too many chocolate chips in the batter. After 2 years of dating, he took us to the beach for a picnic. While Susanna built sandcastles, he got down on one knee in the sand. He pulled out a ring and asked if he could officially join our family. Susanna ran over screaming yes before I could even answer. She jumped up and down asking if she could be the flower girl and wear a pretty dress. Then she looked at Tom with those serious eyes kids get and asked if she could call him dad. He started crying and said he'd be honored to be her dad if that's what she wanted. We got married 6 months later in our backyard with just 20 people there. Susanna wore this pink dress she picked out herself and carried a basket of daisies instead of throwing petals because she said that was boring. When it came time for speeches, she grabbed the microphone from the DJ and climbed up on a chair. She told everyone how happy she was to have a family that loved her and didn't care about blood types or DNA tests. My mom started crying and my dad had to walk away for a minute to compose himself. Even my mother-in-law wiped her eyes behind her glasses. The letter from Zyler came 3 weeks after the wedding. The prison return address made my stomach turn, but I opened it anyway. He wanted to see Susanna and said he had rights as her biological father. I called her therapist that afternoon and we talked for an hour about whether this would help or hurt Susanna's progress. The therapist said Susanna wasn't ready to process seeing him behind bars and might not ever be. I wrote back a simple no and filed the letter with all the other legal documents in case he tried to push it through the courts. The FBI investigation into the fertility clinics made national news 6 months later. They found patterns of fraud at 12 different facilities across 7 states. Congress started hearings and new regulations got drafted requiring video consent for all procedures and mandatory oversight committees. I got a call from a senator's office asking if I'd testify about what happened to us. I flew to Washington and sat in front of a panel of lawmakers telling them how my body was violated without my knowledge or consent. 3 other women testified that same day with similar stories of reproductive fraud. The coverage led to dozens of victims reaching out to me through social media and email. We started a private Facebook group that grew to over 200 members in the first month. We decided to meet in person and rented a church basement for our first gathering. 15 women showed up, and we spent 3 hours sharing our stories and crying together. We meet every month now, and sometimes the lawyers who helped us come to answer questions. Tom filed the adoption papers on Susanna's 7th birthday as her present. She'd been asking when he could officially be her dad, and the judge made it happen within 2 months. The courtroom was packed with our friends and family, and when the judge signed the papers, Susanna jumped into Tom's arms. She said he was the dad she always deserved, and everyone in the courtroom started clapping. 5 years passed faster than I expected. Susanna turned 10 and joined the soccer team and started learning piano. She knew her story in basic terms that her therapist helped us explain in age-appropriate ways. She understood that being loved was what made a real family, and that DNA didn't matter. Sometimes at night when I couldn't sleep, I'd think about Zyler in his prison cell. But mostly I didn't think about him at all anymore. He stole years from us, but he couldn't steal our future. Susanna was thriving, and that was all that mattered. The years kept moving, and suddenly Susanna was 16. The egg donor sent a letter on her birthday saying she'd followed our story and was proud of the young woman Susanna had become. Susanna read it at the kitchen table, then looked up at me. She said she was grateful to exist, but I was her only mom and always would be. She put the letter in a box with other memories and never mentioned it again. Tom and I decided to have another baby when Susanna was 8. We went through legitimate IVF with full consent and transparency at every step. The clinic we chose had cameras in every room and required both partners to sign documents in front of witnesses. Susanna came to some of the appointments and asked the doctors a million questions about how babies were made in labs. When her little brother was born, she was right there in the delivery room holding my hand. She became the most protective big sister you could imagine. She'd read him stories every night and taught him his colors and numbers before he even started preschool. When kids at the school asked why they didn't look alike, she'd just shrug and say families come in all shapes. The years started flying by after that, and I went back to the school when Susanna was 9. Law school at 37 wasn't easy, but I had a mission now. Every night after putting the kids to bed, I'd sit at the kitchen table with my textbooks spread out studying reproductive law and medical fraud statutes. Tom would bring me coffee and quiz me on case law, while our son colored at the table next to us. I graduated 3 years later, and immediately started taking cases for women who'd been through similar violations. The first client called me crying so hard she could barely talk, because her doctor had used his own sperm instead of her husband's, and she'd just found out after her son needed a kidney transplant. I helped her file criminal charges, and win a civil suit that changed her life. Word spread, and soon I had a small practice focused entirely on reproductive fraud cases. More women kept finding me through support groups and online forums, and I never turned anyone away who couldn't pay. Susanna watched me work these cases and started asking questions about medical ethics and patient rights. By the time she hit high school, she was writing papers about informed consent and bodily autonomy that made her teachers suggest she consider pre-med or pre-law. She chose bioethics instead because she wanted to change the system from the inside. The acceptance letter from her dream college came with a full scholarship, and she screamed so loud the neighbors came to check on us. At her high school graduation, she was chosen to give a speech as salutatorian. She stood at that podium in her blue cap and gown and told the whole auditorium about fighting for truth when everyone calls you crazy. She looked right at me when she said her mom taught her that love makes a family and standing up for what's right matters more than being believed. The whole place erupted in applause, and I ugly cried into Tom's shoulder while our son recorded it on his phone. We took a family vacation to the beach that summer to celebrate before she left for college. Susanna and her brother built sandcastles while Tom and I watched from our beach chairs, and I realized we weren't just okay anymore. We were actually happy. She came home for Thanksgiving, her first semester practically vibrating with excitement about her medical consent law class. Her professor was using our case as an example of systemic failures in reproductive medicine, and she'd gotten to present on new legislation being proposed. She said she was going to write policy that would prevent what happened to us from ever happening again. The call about Rebecca came during Susanna's sophomore year. The prison called to inform me as a victim that she'd died from pancreatic cancer that spread too fast for treatment. I hung up the phone and felt nothing but relief that she'd never get out to hurt anyone else. Susanna graduated college summa cum laude and introduced me to her boyfriend at the ceremony. He shook my hand and thanked me for raising such an incredible woman and said he knew our whole story because Susanna had told him on their third date to make sure he understood what kind of family he was getting involved with. He said he admired how we'd survived and rebuilt. Time kept moving, and suddenly it was Susanna's wedding day 20 years after that first phone call from Dr. Marito. My parents were there, both of them crying happy tears after spending years trying to make up for not believing me. Tom stood next to me as Susanna's dad in every way that mattered. Our son, now 16 himself, was a groomsman. Even my mother-in-law was there, having become a real grandmother to both kids after finally seeing the truth about her son. During the reception, Susanna pulled me aside while everyone else was dancing. She took my hands and looked me right in the eyes and whispered, "Thank you for never giving up on me, Mom." She said she knew how hard I'd fought and how much I'd sacrificed, and that every single battle was worth it to be standing there as a family. I hugged her tight and knew she was right. All right, that's all from me today. Thanks for sticking with me and letting me throw all my questions out there. Until next time, stay curious. Like the video, it helps more than you think.